You guys there?
Yep. We're good?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Because
We're just
Hi.
testing the YouTube live stream and then we'll start.
absolutely.
Okay. I will work. YouTube works. Yeah? I don't have the link. You go to LinkedIn. I think I tried it. Okay, thank you very much. I could see plenty of people coming online and waiting on YouTube live stream and also here in this room. So first up, I want to thank Federico Iannacci, all the way from UK, for spending time and talking to us. So we are organizing this talk. It's a joint presentation. We run a community of practice here at Swindon, but we've got members all over the globe. We've got about 50 members who just talk and grow their knowledge, collective knowledge of ours. And it's also about M&M, marketing and management departmental seminar. So first up, thank you very much, Fed. I have known Fed for primarily through his work. There were some unanswered questions when I was implementing QCA, and I realized that there's something more to it, which I should be knowing. And I wrote to Fed, I read his papers, he was very kind, he helped me. And then I thought that what the good work that he's doing, that should be shared with a broader audience here in Australia and elsewhere with our community of practice. So with that, I thank Fed for coming and talking to us. So please over to you, Fed. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Malik and Helena, thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. And the presentation will be really about introducing you to a special issue that we have just published in the Information Systems Journal, which is entitled Transcending the Qualitative-Quantitative Divide in IS Research using QCA as a configurational comparative approach. This special issue was co-authored by myself, Bill Ansan, and Professor Chi Win-Tan. I would like to give you an overview of the presentation. First and foremost, I would like to show you what are the special issue aims and objectives. Then I'm going to give a very brief overview of the published papers. I will focus in particular on the methodological innovations. These papers also made some theoretical innovations or contributions, but the focus of my presentation will be primarily reading some excerpts from these papers to show you what are the core methodological innovations. And then I would like to kind of wrap it up with some outstanding issues that still kind of QCA is still facing. And this will give me an opportunity for setting the kind of the opportunity to look at generalized analytic induction as a way to overcome some of those outstanding issues. Because I don't know if some of you are familiar, but Charles Reagan in 2023 has published a new book which is called Generalized Analytic Induction, where he compares qualitative comparative analysis with generalized analytic induction. And therefore, that's a really good opportunity for us to start thinking perhaps about these outstanding issues and how generalized analytic induction can become handy. So first and foremost, the overarching aims and objectives of the special issue. Well, transcending the qualitative-quantitative divide was our overarching aim simply by using configurational approaches, simply because in the information systems field, we witnessed many paradigm wars, for example, between positivism and interpretivism, methodological divides, for example, the qualitative versus quantitative divide, the small n versus the large n divide, and also theoretical divides, for example, variance versus process theories. And our overarching aim in this special issue was to produce research that cuts across these divides, for example, by celebrating the inclusivity of various research paradigms and making methodological contributions, which is going to be really the focus of my presentation. So that means really moving from variance and process theories towards configurational theories, with all the kind of overarching tenets, which are about configurational causation, equifinality, and causal asymmetry, particularly to study mature domains such as information system success, the technology acceptance model from a more configurational perspective. but also moving from mono methods to mixed methods and multi-methods, from variables to sets, because set-theoretic methods, configurational approaches are based on set-theoretic methods, are all about sets which are really groups of objects or people that share particular features, and also, and importantly, moving beyond the traditional positivist versus interpretivist paradigms by embracing new research paradigms, such as, for example, critical realism, which I will touch upon a little bit as I'm going along. So the way I want to present the papers from the special issue is by looking at three axes. The mode of reasoning, which can be either inductive or deductive or abductive / retroductive. So if the conditions are derived empirically from the cases at hand, you have an inductive approach. If they're derived from theories, you have a more deductive approach. And finally, if they are derived through a dialogue between theory and data, then you have an abductive / retroductive approach. I will also talk about the theoretical approaches that have been used by the different papers in published in the special issue. Whether they're about theory building, theory extension / development, or theory testing. And finally, in terms of methodological approach, some papers in the special issue are single methods because they use only FSQCA or QCA as a single methodological technique, or they are either multi-method or mixed methods. So I want to start with the first paper published by Huang et al. Now, the publication date, because the special issue started in 2023, but was eventually published in 2024, we were effectively publishing these papers online on a first come, first served basis. So depending on some papers were published in 2023, Huang et al. Was published in 2024, and the phenomenon of interest was digital disruption. Their aim was to develop a QCA, a ground theory informed QCA, so QCA informed a ground theory. The mode of reasoning was inductive / exploratory because the conditions were identified from the empirical data at hand. They were also calibrated inductively using both crisp and fuzzy sets, and they used a theoretical sampling technique which was based on a purposeful sample. So the theoretical approach is theory building, a configurational theory of digital disruption revolving around 4 industry factors that contingently lead to 2 different types of digital disruptions, namely transformational versus destructive digital disruption. And the methodological approach was multi-method because they used grounded theory method combined with FSQCA in a sequential fashion by using a sample of 21 digitally disrupted industries to develop a configurational theory and subsequently validated by means of a holdout sample of 33 digitally disrupted industries. So the important point here is that they first developed the theory using a sample of 21 digitally disrupted industry. The industry which was subject to digital disruption was the unit of analysis or the case study. And then they subsequently validated the theory through a holdout sample of 33 digitally disrupted industry. So that's a very interesting point, which I want to return to in terms of validation. So the next paper was published in 2023 by Ma et al., which is about technostress. So that's the phenomenon of interest. Here, the mode of reasoning is deductive / confirmatory. Both conditions, measurement items are based on prior theory, and that's why the approach is deductive. They used a random sample of 277 responses, and they used, I would say, classical conventional calibration approaches based on percentiles, specifically the 95th, 50th, and 5th percentile. The theoretical approach is about theory development because they developed, but they also validated a theory of moderation, how to perform moderation in configurational / FSQCA analysis, which again I will get into more detail in a few minutes because that's another massive methodological contribution. And the methodological approach was a single method based on a theoretical argument and empirical illustration developed by using FSQCA only. Next up, we got Meyer. Meyer et al., they actually made 2 contributions. The first article published in 2023 is about telework success. The interesting thing here is that they introduced and they empirically demonstrated how to perform a deductive FSQCA because the conditions and measurements were based on prior theory, And the causal recipes were identified a priori and then intersected with empirically identified sufficient configurations. That's something that both Charles Regin back in 1997 and then Schneider and Wageman in 2012 will be talking about how to perform theory evaluation in QCA through intersections between empirical findings and theoretical propositions. And what Layer et al. Did in this paper, they brought to light and they applied this evaluation template. So the theoretical approach is about theory testing aimed at refining, extending, and delimiting theory by identifying intersections or proposed causal recipes with the empirically identified sufficient configurations. And finally, the methodological approach is a mixed method approach because FSQA, QCA was combined with semi-structured interviews in a sequential fashion by conducting two separate studies. So they first performed an FSQCA and then they subsequently conducted semi-structured interviews, which is a more qualitative and therefore mixed method approach. Next up, there's the other contribution from Layer et al. 2024, which is about successful chatbot interactions. The model reasoning here was adaptive because the conditions were identified by means of semi-structured interviews, but the measurement items were adapted from existing theory. So that's when the dialogue between theory and data comes handy. They also included a disruptive situation to capture two different scenarios: the presence of chatbot interactions versus the absence. The theoretical approach is theory development because the authors develop propositions about the theoretical mechanisms across and within sufficient configurations that need willingness to interact with chatbots. And once again, the methodological approach is mixed methods. This time around, they first conducted semi-structured interviews, and then there was a follow-up QCA, which was based on a scenario-based study that employed FSQCA, where the two scenarios under investigations were the presence versus the absence of successful chatbot interactions. Next up, we got Soltani, De Glosch et al. 2024. The phenomenal interest here was civic crowdfunding platforms. Again, the approach was adaptive because the conditions were identified both theoretically, based on the voluntary action model, and empirically, by analyzing deviant consistency cases in kind. The theoretical approach is theory development. They developed a middle-range theory of 5 distinctive configurational profiles that display the heterogeneity of civic backers' motivations, including civic champions, pro-social advocates, normative supporters, reward seekers, and regret-averse contributors. And finally, the methodological approach is a mixed method approach because there is FSQCA combined with a follow-up extreme case study, which was space high, which is aimed at identifying 4 boundary conditions that are not captured by the FSQCA results. And these boundary conditions are worldview, self-efficacy, social trust, and next generation needs and sustainability. I will show you how they went about identifying these boundary conditions using XY plots in a minute. Once again, that's a methodological contribution or innovation because very few studies actually make use of XY plots to analyze their cases in depth. So the last paper that was part of the special issue was the paper by Zhang and Ramesh, which was about blockchain platforms. Here the model reasoning is adaptive because they used conditions, they derived conditions from secondary data, but they were informed by existing blockchain governance theories. And the sample is based on sufficient homo/heterogeneity of on-chain governance cases. Their approach is theory development. The theoretical approach is theory development because they developed a middle-range theory of ideal types and not ideal types of governance design elements with respect to generative and evaluative governance engagement. And finally, the methodological approach is a simple method because they only employed FSQCA based on secondary data such as white papers, blogs, and official websites. And the calibration procedure is based on ideal types. Again, that's a very important point. Not very much, or many scholars use this ideal type approach, which is suited very much when you have in-depth data, in this particular context, secondary data. And they used a 4 anchor point scale, which was 0, 0.33, 0.67, and 1. So now I would like to go into a little bit more detail to show you the methodological contributions derived from these papers. So the first contribution is the deductive FSQCA approach. So this is an extract from the paper published by Mayer et al. In 2023. Remember, the key point here is to find intersections between empirical finding and theoretical propositions in order to test and therefore evaluate their theory. So the argument was our evaluation, including these steps. First, we mapped how the empirically identified configurations, which they describe with an E, intersect with our theoretically proposed causal recipes, which they define with an E. So T is the theoretical causal recipes, E is the empirical propositions or the empirical configurations. This allows us to refine theory by examining if and how the theoretical causal recipes are supported by empirical data. And that's the intersection between empirical configurations and theoretical causal recipes. Second, we identified empirical findings that do not overlap with the theoretical causal recipes by mapping how the empirically identified configurations intersect with the negative theoretical causal recipes. Empirically identified configurations with the lack of T, because the tilde sign is lack of. So the lack of theory gives you the lack of overlap between empirical configurations and theoretical configurations. This enabled us to extend theory based on empirically identified configurations. And third, we revealed configurations suggested by our causal recipes that are not covered by the sufficient configurations based on the empirical data. So that's the intersection between not E, the lack of empirical configurations, and T, the theoretical proposition. And this allowed them to delimit theory based on the theoretical causal recipes not supported by empirical data. They also intersected the lack of E with the lack of T to identify those configurations that were outside their theoretical refinement, extension, and delimitation. So that's how they mapped their findings. You got E and T here, which is, sorry, the lack of E and the lack of T, which is outside their theoretical kind of limit. And then you have the theory refinement, which is the overlap between theory and empirical findings. Theory delimitation, which is the lack of theory in combination with the theoretical propositions. And finally, theory extension, which is, the lack of theory with the empirical findings. So that's theory extension. The delimitation of theory is the lack of empirical finding with the theoretical propositions. So that's deductive against QCA. Again, very few articles have been using, first of all, this core tenet that stems from Charles Reid in 1997, seminal book, and then from the follow-up book from Schneider and Wageman, published in 2012. And there have been a few authors, a few scholars that have proposed theory evaluation, but very few scholars have actually applied this template. So this is the first application of this template as far as we know. Next, I want to talk about a little bit grounded theory, because grounded theory is really the bread and butter of qualitative research. And we should never forget that qualitative comparative analysis is a qualitative methodology. So the Q stands for qualitative, not for quantitative. So they proposed a QCA informed by grounded theory approaches. And they say research also contributes methodologically by demonstrating the merits of expanding QCA's theory building potential with grounded theory. Although QCA is recognized as an important method for IS research, IS stands for Information Systems Research, studies using QCA have largely focused on topics that have been extensively studied. In other words, the QCA approach in IS research is tending to focus on expanding or revitalizing existing theory rather than building substantially new theory. This is because for QCA to produce causal recipes, it must have a list of theoretically based conditions to use as inputs. Naturally, researchers find the conditions based on existing research and build the configurational theory abductively or even deductively, as we've seen from the previous study. Yet, this limits the applicability of QCA in building configurational theory for new phenomena from scratch, without drawing on theoretical frameworks from existing perspectives. This paper addresses this limitation by combining grounded theory method and QCA to inductively develop a novel configurational theory. So effectively here the theory. Sorry, I can hear a voice in the background. If you guys can keep quiet, please. So the point is that these conditions were derived from a previous, from the cases at hand, and therefore from inductively derived from the empirical data. So that's how they compare and contrast effectively a grounded theory approach to existing approaches, which are either abductive or deductive. So, for example, the existing conventional approaches of QCA are either based on a single theory or on a multiplicity of theories. But all these theories, whether it is single or multiple, inform the conditions. So the conditions are either deductively or abductively derived through a dialogue between theory and data. Then there is a QCA analysis, which is followed up by the interpretation of the configurational patterns, and then the development of causal recipes in terms of propositions. Whereas the approach that Juan et al. Advocate is, first and foremost, developing an emergent theory which develops from scratch. They develop from scratch inductively, so these conditions are effectively informing the development of a new theory because they are inductively derived from the empirical data. Then there is the QCA analysis, the interpretation of the observed configurational patterns in combination with preliminary emergent theory. Then you have the emergent theory, and then you have the validation of this theory through a holdout sample. Because you first need to develop a theory on a particular sample, which in that case was 21 digital disruptive industries, and then you need to have a new sample to validate your theory. You can't validate the theory on the same sample. Okay, so that's the methodological contribution. That's about theory development, or theory building, but also theory validation, because it's only through validation that you can strengthen your theory. Next up, the moderation template. This is another major contribution. I will read an extract from my talk 2024, then I'll show you how to apply this moderation template in practice. Okay? So, in the first stage, so effectively this moderation template consists of conducting two QCA. First, the QCA without the moderating condition, and then with the moderator, or the moderating condition. So in the first stage, IS scholars use QCA to achieve primary conjunctional causation without the consideration of the proposed moderator. In the second stage, information system scholars include the proposed moderator and run a new QCA to examine its influence on the primary conjunctional causation by checking how the moderator affects the interdependence among causal factors. Now, there are three requirements for moderation, which I want to show you empirically in the next slide. The first requirement is that there should be no changes in the causal factors within the causal recipe from the first to the second stage. The second requirement is that there should be at least one moderated configuration that has changes of core/peripheral condition. This means that there needs to be a switch from core to peripheral, from peripheral to core between the two stages. And finally, the third requirement for moderation is that in at least one of the present moderated configurations, the moderator should be a core present condition. Okay, let's look at this template from the empirical analysis. Remember, the analysis was based on a single QCA, which was about identifying the causes that lead to technostress. So in the first stage, they did a QCA, and they found three solutions. Remember, these are intermediate solutions because there are core and peripheral conditions. So the conditions are pace of change, privacy invasion, information relevance, and information equivocality. Then in the next stage, they run a new QCA with a moderating condition, which is subjective social support norm. So the first requirement is that the same conditions should be present in both solutions. So you can see that S1 has the same condition, S2 has the same conditions, presence of privacy invasion, information relevance, and information equivocality. And S3 has the presence of pace of change, the absence of privacy invasion, the absence of information relevance, and the presence of information equivocality. So the conditions are the same. The first requirement is met. The second requirement is that there should be a switch from core to peripheral or from peripheral to core. And if you look at configuration S2, you have a switch of information equivocality from core to peripheral when you're moving from the first QCA to the second QCA. Likewise, if you're looking at information relevance, there is the absence of information relevance in S3, and that switches from core to peripheral when you're doing the new QCA with the moderating condition. And finally, in at least one of the configuration, the moderating configuration, so far the two moderating configurations are S2 and S3, in at least one of them, the moderator should be a present core condition, and this happens in S2. This means that S2 is a candidate for moderation, and then you have to empirically identify this candidate. So they argue that it was a candidate because you have technostress upon the contingency of social support norm. So if social support norm is present and is a core present condition, then privacy invasion, information relevance, and information equivocality will cause technostress. So that was the argument, and that's the template for moderation. Another thing that I want to show you is the use of XY plots. Here I'm going to show you Soltan Integrosha, a quote from their paper. They argue that about clear consistency cases in Canada. By the way, these cases are the cases that are located in the bottom right-hand corner of the XY plot. they are effectively deviant because they show the condition or the combination of conditions, but they do not have the outcome of interest. So they argue, real suggests that examining deviant cases with regard to consistency in kind to identify omitted causal conditions. These cases are puzzling, and the most plausible reason for their existence is the underfitting of the QCA sufficient configuration. That is, the configurations lack a relevant condition. So that's how they identify the boundaries of their theoretical model, but they also used a mixed method approach. So what they did was, effectively, they first ran a QCA, which was underpinned by a survey research. Then they run effectively a qualitative data analysis as a follow-up step. So there was an in-depth qualitative analysis, which was based on space height as their extreme case studies. They used interviews and they coded through inductive coded multiple they used multiple classification schemes. And finally, they developed meta-inferences based on the triangulation of quantitative and qualitative findings, the corroboration of these findings and their complementarity, and finally the identification of boundary conditions based on the XY plot that I showed you earlier on, and the development of practical implications. So what are the outstanding issues? So this leads me to the last part of my presentation, where I want to show some of the outstanding issues of QCA, and also some of the points that Charles Rady made in his book with an empirical demonstration in a work in progress that we have currently under review. So the first issue is the issue of time and temporality. To be honest with you, there was a paper which was submitted to the special issue, which was about time and temporality, but unfortunately it got rejected through the rounds, but it has been eventually published in another journal, which I can give you and I'm happy to share the details if you're interested in time and temporality. But the key point is that QCA has been criticized for not dealing with time and temporality very well. So there are different ways to address this issue, but no article in a special issue has addressed this particular issue, the temporality issue. As I said, there are many different ways of addressing the temporality issue. One way to do that, for example, in a recent paper published in the Journal of Strategic Information System, myself and my co-author, we have used a panel data analysis. So panel data is one way to do that. Another way is to use more qualitative approaches and return to the cases at hand. Another issue that I would like to flag up is the discussion of directional expectations. Most of the study in the special issue do not explain the directional expectations, thus leaving them unspecified and therefore showing an intermediate solution that matches the complex solution. That's an important point, because if you have read Schneider and Weichmann 2012 very carefully, you will see that they develop different ways of arriving at intermediate solutions, and they develop the theory-enhanced qualitative comparative analysis. 22E, theory-enhanced qualitative comparative analysis, is a way of trying to justify your directional expectations that then are going to inform the easy counterfactuals, because when you actually derive your solutions, you have both easy and difficult counterfactuals. If you do not specify your directional expectations, you leave them unspecified, that means that each and every condition will contribute to the outcome of interest when it is either present or absent, and therefore, by default, the software will arrive at an intermediate solution that matches the complex solution. And finally, and this is an important point that Schneider and Weichmann in 2012 have mentioned, and then Charles Rady, obviously, because he's always ahead of the game, has picked up in his new book. The issue of causal asymmetry. This is a double-edged sword. We try to flag up QCA or to showcase our use of QCA because of the causal asymmetry of our findings. But if you think carefully, behind the scenes, what happens? Well, what the QCA, the FSQCA software does is really to identify the lack of the negation of the outcome of interest by Boolean negation. There is 1 minus the score, the calibrated score for your outcome of interest that derives your negated outcome of interest. And what Schneider and Weichmann said back in 2012 was that it would be preferable to rethink the selection of causal conditions and construct a new truth table for the negated outcome, rather than assuming that the same conditions affect both the presence and the absence of the outcome. So that's an issue that I would like to pick up, and I would like to introduce you now a little bit to generalized analytic induction. Why do I want to do that? Because in his 2023 book, Charles Rady does go further than this. He says, well, actually, we should strive to focus only on the positive cases, and we should consider the negative cases as cases that describe or identify something else, something that is totally different. So, a very brief introduction to generalized analytic induction, and then I want to show you a very simple truth table and show you how you can derive causal arguments for this truth table and XY plots. So generalized analytic induction is a set-theoretic technique that revolves around the conditions linked to positive cases. This means the negative cases, that is cases that fail to exhibit a focal outcome, are regarded as instances of something else, and therefore they are the focus of separate analysis. Generalized analytic induction looks for model configurations, that is, combinations of antecedent conditions that are relatively common in a set of cases exhibiting the outcome in question. Okay, think about the mode. So what you're actually doing here, you're looking for model configurations, those configurations or those pre-antecedent conditions that are effectively cutting across all your causal recipes. Now that's a very simple truth table. You will see something different from the normal truth table, which I want to come back to in a second. So here you have AI mindfulness with artificial intelligence as the outcome of interest, and you have 4 conditions which were derived abductively from theory and data. Artificial intelligence trust, artificial intelligence risk perception, artificial intelligence explainability, and AI regulatory clarity. Now, each condition was coded as contributing to the outcome when it is either present or absent, with the exception of risk perception, which was coded as contributing to the outcome of interest only when it is present. What does that mean? This means that generalized analytic induction forces you to frame your directional expectations. If your directional expectation is that people will be mindfully using artificial intelligence only when they actually find it risky, that means that the presence of risk perception rather than its absence contributes to artificial intelligence mindfulness, and therefore its absence, 0-0, this would be 0-0 in a normal truth table, becomes a dash sign because we do not care about this absence, because the absence contributes to something else, which is not the phenomenon we are investigating. So this methodology forces you, first and foremost, to streamline your directional expectation, which is something that seldomly QCA scholars do in their research. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, you focusing only and exclusively on the positive outcome of interest, the presence of artificial intelligence mindfulness, rather than its absence. Because the absence is something else that presumably is being derived from different conditions altogether, because it's a different phenomenon altogether. Now, when you run this generalized analytic induction, you obtain 3 configurations. Configuration 1, which we call the regulation skeptic, features the lack of artificial intelligence trust, the lack of the presence of risk perception, and the lack of regulatory clarity. It has a coverage of 0.34 and a unique coverage of 0.13. So you're only interested in coverage, you're not interested in consistency, because each condition is a superset, is an antecedent of the outcome. So in effect, you're already focusing on your supersets, but the intersection becomes a subset of the outcome of interest. Okay? The unique coverage is what really matters here. Okay, because you can see that the raw coverage of the 3 configurations is pretty much the same, so it is the degree to which each configuration uniquely covers the outcome of interest that makes it more powerful and increases its explanatory power. The second configuration, the lack of AI trust, risk perception, and the lack of AI explainability, makes or creates or generates what we call the AI-resistant or AI-opposed user. And finally, and paradoxically, the presence of AI trust, explainability, and regulatory clarity, in combination with the perception risk, creates what we call an ambivalent mindful user, someone who is ambivalent because he or she both trusts the AI, finds it explainable, finds the regulatory context clear, and yet finds it risky. So takes this ambivalent stance. Importantly, the coverage is 0.63, above the 0.60 threshold, which is a rule of thumb to understand whether you should do a more kind of exploratory study or not. This is a less exploratory, it's on the margin of an exploratory study, because 0.6 is a good coverage of the outcome of interest. Now, what I want to show you is how would you translate these findings in a freestyle chart? Well, you have to think about core in a different way because you're focusing on antecedent conditions. So here, the core condition, those large oval circles, which are black circles, will be your necessary conditions. And as you can see, the necessary condition here is risk perception, because that's a prerequisite for the emergence of AI mindfulness. And then the peripheral conditions are contingent conditions, are the context where the different types of mindful AI users emerge. So for example, if you're looking at the regulation skeptic, this regulation skeptic emerges when there is lack of trust, presence of risk perception, and the lack of regulatory clarity, which is the difference maker compared to the AI opposed user, which emerges when there is a lack of trust, the presence of risk perception, and the absence of explainability. The AI ambivalent user is someone who both trusts the AI, finds it explainable, finds the regulations clear, and yet he or she perceives the AI as being risky. That's why he or she is ambivalent. Now, as you can see, there is no consistency because every single condition is consistent. Okay, so we're not interested in consistency here. What we're interested in is the explanatory power of the outcome of interest. Okay, and the most important configuration, the one that has the largest explanatory power here, is the last one, the AI ambivalent user, because it's got the largest unique coverage, because the overlapping coverage or the raw coverage is partially overlapping with other configurations. Now, how can you derive your causal arguments here? Well, you have to focus on different types of users, starting, for example, from the AI ambivalent user, where the underpinning mechanisms is AI ambivalence. You have to focus on what Schneider calls the best fitting case, the most typical case, with the just typical case. So these are cases that are located on the top right-hand corner of the XY plot, and in particular, it's case 1 versus case 8. This is when you actually, by focusing on these cases, you can identify regularities or irregularities that underpin those mechanisms. Another thing that I want to say is that here you have deviant coverage cases, cases that issue the outcome of interest but are not covered. Okay? So these are the most important cases for your analysis, the cases that are called typical cases. Same thing for the regulation skeptic. You're going to focus on cases 18 or 17 and cases 16 to identify the irregularities. And finally, for the AI opposed user, you will focus on case 2 and case 5 to identify these irregularities. So to wrap it up, QCA is an emerging methodology. RAGE in 1987 has laid the groundwork, but there are many methodological innovations that transcend the qualitative-quantitative divide, which we have been talking about. For example, the didactic FSQCA, which I showed you how to do empirically, was something that RAGE set out back in 1997, and that we didn't pick up until now. Circulating multi-methods now enable the analysis of individual cases regardless of sample size, because you can focus on the most typical cases, the just so typical cases to identify the irregularities, deviant coverage cases, etc., etc. And then generalized analytic deduction enables the study of pattern regularities that inform best practices and overcome the issue of causal asymmetry as an artifact of Boolean negation. It can be seen as an aid to causal interpretation, in particular when you return to the cases and conducting, by doing those XY plots, conducting in-depth analysis between your most typical cases and your just so typical cases. So I'm going to stop sharing. I've got some references here, which I'm very happy to share with you. I can send the slides to Malik, of course. And if you want to reach me, this is my email address, Iannacci@sasset.ac.uk. I'll stop sharing and I welcome any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fed. Fantastic, very fascinating. I've got so many points that I want to discuss, but
thank you.
I have to, look after my position of being the host and giving others the chance, right? So I'll give others the chance. If you've got any questions, so you can unmute yourself, and here's your opportunity to discuss whatever lingering issues that you've had with one of the thought leaders on QCA, as you would know and have observed, right? So over to you. If you've got any questions here, or you want to type. Thank you.
I think already someone asked the question in chat.
Okay, what is
Founder is asking the outcome is more than one.
The outcome is more than one.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is how we can use FSQCA to investigate how configurations can result in several and not one outcomes.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? How can we use QCA to investigate?
Yeah, so that question was put to me at ACES as well. So the question is,
Yeah.
can we use QCA when we've got more than one outcomes?
Well, then I would say no, you can't study more than one outcome. The best thing to do is you have to focus on one outcome and run multiple QCA to study multiple outcomes. To a degree, this is what Charles Ragin does with the generalized analytic induction. There is one outcome, the positive outcome, and then the outcome, the negation of the outcome is something else. And therefore, you have to run a separate analysis, which means that you have to identify different conditions. So, if you want to study the same outcome, okay, using or multiple outcomes using the same conditions, you're gonna be most likely finding really you have to build a really tough case here because the reviewers are gonna go against you. It's very difficult to argue that the same conditions lead to multi-finality, multiple outcomes, because the whole point of QCA is to study equifinality, multiple configurations, causal conditions leading to the same outcome. So my advice here is to run multiple QCAs to study multiple outcomes, and each QCA should be informed by different conditions and different configurations of conditions. So if you, for example, look at some of the books published in qualitative research, they study multi-finality. To study multi-finality, they always embrace multiple configurations. Okay, George and Bennett, they published a book on case study methods that really is a powerful book to explain multi-finality using case study approaches and comparative approaches. So that would be my advice, to look at George and Bennett, 2005. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased because this question was raised by Mehdi, and he was there at ACES, and the same question was asked, and I gave the same response. I'm so happy that
Thank you.
one of the thought leaders, Fed, is validating what I told them, Mehdi. Good. Any other questions we've got here? Okay, what I'll do now is I will first, there were other questions that were asked to me at ACES, and I'm pretty sure if there's some questions there, I'll put that to you, Fed, but there will be other questions that are normally asked, and I'll share that with you. And actually, Mehdi asked me one question, and you refer to that in your slides. So I'll ask you that one as clarification. So, see, many of the IS scholars follow the tradition which you showed on your slides as well. It is either variance theorizing or it's other process theorizing. So Mehdi asked me a very pertinent question in the ACES, and I immediately picked up that he's been reading Andy Burton-Jones' 2015 paper where they put it like this, that they're on a theme. So so first of all, I'll go to you, right? So how do you place QCA in this dichotomy of process theorizing and variance theorizing? I did mention to them that there are other school of thoughts like academic management, and they actually say sometimes 3, sometimes more, but the third that they say is typology development, which is actually very much aligned to the configuration analysis. That was my answer. If you want to add to this one, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. That's another very important question. That was one of the aims of the special issue, to try to go beyond variance and process theories, but to actually look at them from a configurational perspective. So we claim that the best approach is to actually study these, or to draw on systems theory to study effectively configurational phenomena. So the configurational perspective, which is based on FSQCA techniques or QCA techniques, in my opinion, should be grounded on systems thinking, because systems thinking looks at the interdependence of causal conditions that generate something. Then, of course, there are different flavors. So, for example, Elder Bass, who is also a system thinker, he has a more critical realist take on system thinking. So he identifies within a system what he calls core conditions, but also contingent conditions. The core conditions are necessary for the emergence of phenomena. The contingent conditions are actually part of the context, and they can change from contingency to contingency. Now, if you look carefully at my presentation, and in particular the slides I presented on generalized analytic induction, but I've also done that in previous papers on QCA, I've been drawing on these ideas to represent the freestyle chart with the core conditions as being necessary and the contingent conditions as being peripheral. So my take is that we need to move beyond variance and process theories, which has always been the core focuses. and we need to start embracing systems theory as a different kind of theoretical stance, which is informed by configurational approaches. Then, of course, you can have a degree of variance of process theory in your theorizing. So the overarching theory should be system theory. And then, depending on whether you're doing process tracing or not, perhaps you can focus on processes and embrace some elements of process theories when you return to the cases. But so my take is that it really depends on the aims and objectives of your study. So sometimes configurational multiplicity could be the way forward, always informed by configurational perspectives and set theoretic methods. But the overarching approach should be based on systems theory, and sometimes, depending on whether you want to study processes or you're not, trying to blend it with some form of weak process theorizing or weak variance theorizing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I don't know, Malik, if this is my answer that was similar to your answer.
It's actually an open question, and you have given certainly added to what I mentioned earlier is that it's another form of theorizing in addition to variance and process, and doesn't mean that these are mutually exclusive. They could be overlaps. This is what you essentially mentioned. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have another question from Amir. Can you ask directly?
Sure. So with regards to the table that we had in the presentation, I think that was for the AI mindfulness, AI trust, and so on. So I assume that was a qualitative studies.
Yes, it is a qualitative study.
It
is a little bit of a mixed method study. So usually when we do qualitative study, we try to derive our conditions inductively. But in this particular study, because we're drawing in on critical realism/positivism, we also try to validate the data through a follow-up survey. But that survey was targeted to a small sample of purposefully selected decision makers, key decision makers who were actually making core decisions with regard to the use of AI. So it was a qualitative study, yes, it was, but there was also a follow-up small survey targeted to a small purposeful sample of key decision makers in policing.
So how did you decide with regard to the membership? For example, for AI Trust, how did you decide that should be 1 or 0.5 or this?
Yes, so what we did is, that was exactly the problem. The problem was that we didn't have, so when you're doing calibration is the most important point. There are two issues with calibration. The first point is the anchor points. When the scholars use these percentiles, and some of the papers that we publish in the special issues, they do use percentiles, like the 95, 50, and 5th percentile. They should be really the last resort. You should never do that. Ideally, you should always speak to the experts. The point is that when we were talking to these experts, there was no agreement because they are literally just embarking on the deployment of artificial intelligence, especially the use of generative AI, to, for example, robotic process automation, to automate tasks, editing tool, to edit, for example, interviews that you do with the suspects or with the victims, etc., etc. So there were no benchmarks for the external anchor points. That was an issue. So the default could have been either to use percentiles, which we had done in a robustness test, or to run a survey. That's why we ran a survey. The point of the survey was to, let's run a survey and let's put these questions, this construct that we came up with abductively through theory and data, let's actually ask them questions on a 5-point Likert scale. Well, 1 is basically fully out and 5 is fully in. So that becomes like more continuous scale, and we're no longer arbitrarily setting these anchor points, but we're letting the informants set their own kind of point, and then we use the traditional method of calibration, the direct method of calibration, to effectively calibrate those Likert scale scores into a continuous fuzzy set, and that's when we arrive at those scores. So we did the calibration in 2 ways. Firstly, by using Likert scales, and then secondly, by running a robustness test, doing a percentiles, looking at percentiles.
So if you don't...
I want to thank you for asking this question, because calibration and also the identification of conditions is the most important thing. In a way, it's garbage in, garbage out. If your conditions are not carefully selected, you are plugging in garbage, you're going to get garbage out. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. So it's clarifies a lot of things. So I guess my last question is, if we only have qualitative data, and we are not going to collect further data like what we did, then how it's possible to do your calibration just based on the qual data?
So there are papers that have been published. So in our special issue, if you look at the grounded theory paper, what they used was the ideal type technique. So you identify an ideal type. So I can give you a few references. My colleague Sofia Pagliari has been publishing a lot of papers with Block as well on this matter. So I can give you a few papers that are entirely focused on qualitative calibration. But the methodology that they used in this special issue and that I used in the past as well was this ideal type, which is based on Basurto's approach. So you identify an ideal type and then you score your cases based on the qualitative evidence that you have for every single case against that ideal type. Now, the important point is that an ideal type is work in progress. So as you gather more data, maybe you're going to refine the ideal type. It's not something that is set in stone. But that's one way to do it. So there are different ways of doing it. This was the approach that I used in previous papers. One paper was published in Information Systems Journal, and then was picked up by Juan et al. In the quantitative theory for QCA. But Sofia Pagliari and the blog, they looked at, and this Barbara this as well, they looked at a variety, they explored different ways of calibrating qualitative data. So it can be done. My only issue is that there is always an element of subjectivity. And that was the reason why, in this particular work in progress that I'm presenting today, we decided to actually run a survey. Because when you run the survey, and the survey was not done for statistical purposes, it was done simply and purely to identify conversion validity. So we had some hunches. What those constructs, some constructs that they agreed with, and how do we actually make sure that those calibrations that you're arriving at are not simply informed by your subjective biases. So that's why we use this survey to actually then arrive at the scales and then use the direct method of calibration to calibrate our conditions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Related to, there are other questions from the audience. Do you have other questions? I've got a couple of questions, and one question is related to Amir's. But before I go to Amir's question, I will ask you another question, which probably I would find, I'm assuming that most people would find or use QCA want to use. So now you showed your special issue. It has become somewhat customary to present the results in terms of peripheral and core conditions. It's become very much fashionable. Now, in the same community practice, we had a scholar from an academic from Germany, and she mentioned to me, quote unquote, I met Fis, and I asked about the core and periphery, and Fis was introduced that in 2011 academic management. So he said, quote unquote, I would never use core and peripheral conditions again. So that was something that was told to me in 2022. And then I also followed some work, your work, and also your co-author, Ratan. You know that, we've been talking. He is sort of, he's not using those as well. So there are some people who just reporting intermediate, and they're saying that they're not differentiating results in terms of the empirical strength, as is the case with core and peripheral. What's your take on that? Thanks.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. So first and foremost, I had a few informal chats with Pierre Fis, and he also told me that Charles Reagan does not like the differentiation between core and peripheral. Let's put this aside, whether he likes it or not, because that's not really the issue. The issue is that it's become conventional. We need to have an algebra, a notation, a way of communicating our findings. And I would say that this has become the taken for granted way of communicating our findings. So in a way, it's like a language for QCA scholars to communicate the languages. What is the underpinning assumption that? Well, if something is at the core, that means that it survives both difficult and easy counterfactuals. So you need to understand the logic behind QCA and then the argument. If you survive in both easy and difficult counterfactual, then you have a solution which is really at the very core. But if you are only surviving the peripheral, the easy counterfactuals, then you have something which is at the periphery. So there is a very strong and powerful metaphor. in my studies, what I tried to do was to try to reframe this core and periphery in terms of necessary and contingent conditions. So I'm drawing critical realism here. And again, if you are using the latest kind of spin-off of QCA, which is Charles Reagan generalized analytic induction, where there is no consistency and there is only one solution, there this approach is quite fitting, because as I showed you in my findings, I'm using the same algebra, the same kind of Boolean algebra that Pierre-Fils has been using, but I'm using that to refer to something different, something which is at the very core is necessary for your causal argument, and something which is at the periphery is contingent, because it's relevant for one configuration, but it's totally irrelevant for another configuration. So there are different ways of interpreting core and peripheral. But I would say that we need to have a conventional way of communicating our findings as a community. QCA has been accused, or the QCA community, for being too young, too immature, for always coming up with new kind of conventions. So we need to have conventional way of showing our findings. And in my opinion, that's a powerful way to show it. It's what is being used across the globe by every single researcher. So I think we should carry on using it. And in a way, what we're trying to do with this paper, which eventually, when it's going to be published, I'm hoping that it's going to gain traction, is to show that there is continuity. So we're using the same algebra that Pierre-Fils has been using to show that there is some form of continuity. And we're trying to overcome some of those limitations, in particular the notion of Boolean negation as an artifact. Studying negative cases as an artifact of your Boolean negation. We're trying to show that there is some continuity in what we're doing. So I hope I answered your question.
It's an ongoing debate, as you mentioned, and very rightly so. So many. I really want to talk to you for another 1 hour, actually, because I've got this liberty of talking to you, and I have so many questions that I have. Probably, we just have another session sometime later in the year or next year, where we just talk about the issues that I've come across. So I'll just finish with last, if there's no other question here, is your final thoughts, and that was put to me as well, and that somewhat relates to Amir's question here in the audience here. Where is the qualitative in the qualitative comparative analysis? Right? So that's, papers are written in like that, and this question was also asked to me in the ACES. Now you've answered that to Amir in a way. Now I've been wondering, actually, I've been reading your papers and others, and I've been reflecting about this thing. Actually, Amir is sitting here, he's my co-author, and he's a qualitative researcher, and I've been asking them to do this thing and to leave the QCA part to me. And 2, 3, 4 years, he hasn't been able to come up with the calibration of his. So, to me, I think it's all in the theoretical positioning. If you're using it as a critical realism and positivism, it's very easy what you've just done. But if you're an interpretivist, which actually creates a different knowledge, which creates a knowledge which is not causal explanation, it's more of understanding. So what Amir does is an interpretivist. So he tries to understand, so how can he link X to Y? So those are the things that I have in my mind. Over to you, please. Thanks.
So, Malik, can you, because there was a little bit of background noise, what is your question? Can you just repeat your question just in a few words?
My question is, why pure interpretivist studies are less in terms of the qualitative and QCA? Pure interpretivist studies. Thanks.
So, yeah, that's a very important question. I mean, to a degree, the publication of the QCA, or the grounding theory informed QCA, was our attempt to embrace the interpretivist paradigm. So obviously, it's very hard to do interpretivist studies using QCA, because one of the core assumptions is that you have to derive your conditions inductively, and then you have to calibrate them inductively. And it's very difficult to do the calibration when you don't have external anchor points. So in a way, those scholars that use positivist/deductive QCA approaches, they have an advantage, because by using Likert scales, they can easily convert those Likert scales into some form of fuzzy sets and use continuous fuzzy sets to as the calibration goes on. So I think interpretivist approaches can be done, They are harder because they're based on a more inductive logic. But we tried to show how to do it with the grounded theory informed QCA paper. Sophia Pellegrini has been, and also Javis, they've been advocating, well, they're primarily advocating the use of critical release studies, but they also are great fans of more interpretivist slash, I would say, inductive approaches. But they're definitely harder. They're harder. As you can see, what we say in the Huang et al. Paper, which, by the way, I had to carefully review several times. It went through several rounds because it has to be done rigorously. So it's not just an issue of identifying the conditions, because remember, the issue is garbage in, garbage out. It's also the issue of calibration, which has to be done inductively, and one way to do it is by using the ideal types that I mentioned earlier on. But then there's also the issue of validating the theory. And the key point they make in the paper is that you can't validate the theory using the same sample, even though that's a purposefully selected sample. You need to select a new purposeful sample. So what they did, they split up the sample into the first part, which was about theory building, and the second part, the hold out sample, which they held up, in order to validate the theory. So that's the powerful point. So yes, we are for interpretivism. It's more challenging because it's more challenging to derive the conditions, but then you have to also validate your model. And to validate your model, you need a new sample. You can't validate the model on the same sample.
Fantastic. I'm mindful of the time. I don't want this to end. I just continue listening to you and having this discussion because the whole purpose of this community of practice is that we don't get this opportunity to be talking to experts who knows, unlike other methods where there are plenty of. So at the end, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank you, Fred, for taking time. It's fascinating stuff. We'll keep in touch. You've been very kind of talking to me earlier in previous years, right, giving help, giving notes, and I'm pretty sure that anyone who is attending here, you would be similarly kind to him, and we should be share the slides that I'll share with Matthew. So thank you very much. Fantastic.
Thanks everyone for the work. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
To enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye. And by the way, I'm very happy to share the papers that you want, about from Sophia Pellegrini or the colleagues. For example, there are papers that look at the use of qualitative methods that review different qualitative techniques to calibrate the data that I can send to you. There was one published by the Block of Peace.
Yes, Block Institute. Yep.
Sophia Pellegrini has been publishing a lot, so definitely I can share them with you if you want to.
No, we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure. It's been such a great evening for me to hear in Australia. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Cheers, brother.